But today we're going to talk about this Plantinga reading on which he tries to show that faith and at least science, and I think, anyway, faith and science in particular are not in conflict on a particular claim. And I think we're going to talk about how he might be right in general, more generally about the lack of conflict between faith and reason. Okay, so let me get y'all up on the PowerPoint here so I can share the screen. First, we need to talk about what reason is. And the way Plantinga is conceiving of things, reason consists of a bunch of different faculties. You might talk about perception, intuition, memory, testimony, induction. You might talk about deduction as another one. But basically, when we talk about reason, we don't want to just think about what we would narrowly construe as reason, being able to reason through things like Sherlock Holmes or something, like whatever, you sit down and you close your eyes and you think about it. But reason, in Plantinga's view at least, involves our perception. So if we base a belief off of, I see that there's a tablet in front of me, I see that I'm sitting on a deck, and I form the belief that I'm sitting on a deck, we don't say that my belief wasn't based on reason, right? Similarly, intuition, this is sort of a specialized term, kind of. What he means here is this sort of immediate non-physical perception that we have about things like numbers. So we can just kind of intuit or perceive non-physically that 2 + 2 = 4, right? We don't have to see it happen in the world concretely. Memory, again, when you remember that something happened, you don't say that that's unreasonable or that you're not basing your belief on reason. Testimony, that is someone attesting to something, telling you that something is true and you believing it on that basis. Induction, this is basically what we do in science. We observe several cases and we draw a general conclusion. I've seen 17 swans in my life. They were all white. I conclude that all swans are white. Not actually true, but that's just true of induction. And there may be others, he says. But these are the kinds of faculties we talk about when we talk about reason. Faith, on the other hand, he construes as a separate, its own faculty. And what that means is, it's not identical to memory or testimony or perception or deduction or induction or anything like that. It's a separate faculty. It's distinct from, just as testimony is a source of belief, distinct from perception, faith is a source of belief distinct from both. And more generally, let's go back a second. When we talk about faculties, we're talking about these things as distinct sources of belief. Okay? The two lessons to draw from that, the fact that it's a separate faculty doesn't mean that he thinks it's in conflict with reason, right? He just thinks it's different enough from these other things that it merits being called the separate faculty. And that doesn't mean it's in conflict, just as calling testimony a distinct faculty from perception, which it seems to be. You believing something because someone told you it was true is different from seeing that it's true. It doesn't mean automatically that those two faculties are in conflict. And similarly, it doesn't imply that our faith-based beliefs are unjustified. Just having a distinct faculty of memory, for example, doesn't make our memory-based beliefs unjustified. Right? It's just a distinct faculty because it seems distinct. It seems like a different kind of thing. Now, Plantinga wants to define. Let's just talk through one of these definitions that he comes up with. He doesn't really define it precisely, so I'm kind of reading between the lines here. Weak conflict. So weak conflict occurs between new evidence and a belief you already hold. I think that's the way he's using it. So you get weak conflict when new evidence contradicts your current belief, does not weaken your justification for it. New evidence that contradicts your current belief but does not weaken your justification for it is in weak conflict with your current belief. So he is kind of assuming one kind of example, and I'll just try to spell it out a little bit. It's not going to be exactly the way he uses the example, but the heart of it will be the same. Suppose you're on trial for a mugging. Now, you didn't do it, and you know you didn't do it, right? You remember where you were. You were 800 miles away. You were at some conference or whatever concert, and maybe you don't, there's not even evidence that you were there, but you remember being there. So, but at the same time, there can happen that there is strong evidence for something that's not true, and there happens to be strong evidence that you committed this mugging. Like they have camera footage of someone that looks just like you doing the mugging. You maybe even like there are witnesses that say they saw you, maybe even people that know who you are, antecedent to this mugging, say that it was you. Now, so the question here is, here's the big question in this case. You can grant, so this is not the question yet, but let me back up a little bit. You can grant that the evidence against you is strong. But then here's the question. Should you change your belief? Should you change your belief that you did not commit the mugging? It seems like the obvious answer is no. If you have strong memory that you were at a different place 800 miles away, I mean, you weren't even in the vicinity for weeks around that time. You were, 800 miles away for 3 weeks on either side of this thing, say, you can grant that the evidence against you is strong and still change your belief, right? Right? You can imagine someone doing that, and that's probably what they should do. They can say, yeah, I grant you've got strong evidence against me. I'm not going to weaken my belief that I didn't do this, though. Even it's a weird situation, right? Because you'll say, if I were in the juror's shoes, I would convict me too. Nevertheless, I'm not going to change my belief that I didn't do this, right? Does that make sense? So that would be a case of weak conflict, where new evidence contradicts your current belief or supports a claim contradictory to your current belief, but it doesn't weaken your justification for your current belief. It doesn't mean you should weaken your belief, in other words. Okay, so now that we hopefully have that definition down for weak conflict, here's how Plantinga is going to use that claim. He's going to say that these certain scientific claims, which people often think are in conflict with faith, are at best only in weak conflict with faith. And what that means, if we follow our definition out, is that they are such that they contradict, or they support a claim contradicts our current or the belief supported by faith, but they shouldn't weaken that belief, right? Okay. So what are supposed to be some conflicts between faith and reason, so that we can see if they actually are in conflict, right? If they're actually in something more than weak conflict, right? So what we're really worried about here, I'm going to stop sharing just to vary things up a little bit, is when we worry about the conflict between faith and reason, we're not worried about weak conflict, I think, right? We want to know, does reason entail that we should abandon our beliefs, our faith-based beliefs? If it's just sort of like a jury situation, like, oh, I see why your evidence is powerful, given your perspective, but it doesn't convince me to abandon. It doesn't even rationally convince me to abandon my beliefs. Then that's not worrisome, right? So we've just gotten this definition of weak conflict allows us to get a little more precise in what we're actually wondering about. So a lot of us initially thought we knew what we were worried about when we worried about the conflict between faith and reason. This is something that people talk about a lot. If you kind of follow culture generally, I mean, this is something that was debated a lot in the 2000s, maybe the early 2010s, about the new atheist, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and these people. But often when we start to think about something really rigorously, really philosophically, we discover that we were unclear in the beginning what we were even worried about. What this definition of weak conflict helps us to see is we weren't really worried about certain kinds of conflict. between religion and science, or faith and reason, or however you want to put it. Right? It's not really worrisome if they're just in weak conflict. Right? Those are just conflicts where, the evidence from one faculty supports something that the evidence from another faculty does not support, but on reflection, it does entail that we ought rationally to change either set of beliefs. What we're really worried about are cases where science or reason would show that we rationally ought to abandon our faith. That's what we're really worried about when we're talking about conflict. So what we've realized is there are some conflicts which are not really rational conflicts. We could admit that there is a faculty that gives a contradictory verdict in our faith, and not be worried by that, even rationally. Right? So those are cases of weak conflict. But what we're really worried about are cases where there's a conflict between faith and reason, and reason actually undermines faith. It means it entails that you rationally ought to abandon your faith or your belief or something like that. So that means that what we want to know is, is there anything more than weak conflict in the conflict between faith and reason? So let's try to find some actual conflicts. Well, Plantinga focuses in on not just evolution, but the claim that evolution has influenced our religious beliefs, so that they are purely adaptive and not aimed at the truth. Right. So the idea here is that and this is in the background of this happened earlier in the book. The idea here is could potentially undermine our religious beliefs, because we don't hold them because they're true. We hold them because they're adaptive. Here's another one. Sorry, there's a typo in this line. Science says that God has not intervened in nature. If that were true and we're in strong conflict with our faith, then we should abandon our religious beliefs. Science says there is no God. This is not actually true, because I don't think science actually says that, right? Who is science and where is he saying that, right? And I'm wondering about non-science-based cases too, because we're talking about reason in general, right? So what are some non-science-based reasons? Well, I mean, you might think problem of evil might be one. It's not based on science. It's based on the observation of evil, or maybe maybe we're using our moral faculties. Maybe that's another faculty of reason that we're using here. And then kind of combining that with just sort of like reflection, philosophical reflection on the implications of the existence of evil in the world. Whatever. So we've got these cases. Now, we want to know in these particular cases, there's some supposed conflict between science or reason on the one hand and faith. Is it anything more than a weak conflict? Plantinga says no. Any case where science, or any of these cases where science is in supposed conflict with faith, it's only going to be a weak conflict. And the reason is that science assumes what's called methodological naturalism. So he's abbreviating as MN in the text. As you could see, I sent you a whole book. And he never explains MN in the excerpt that I gave you. And that's because he explained it way earlier in the book. And I'm sorry about that. That's just kind of one of the consequences. It is what it is. But MN stood for methodological naturalism. And methodological naturalism just means there are no supernatural entities. There's only natural stuff. But methodological naturalism just means that we're not assuming that there are no supernatural entities. We're not implying that there are no supernatural entities. We're assuming it for the sake of argument, basically. That's what the methodological is doing there. So science, what it does is it says, we don't want to know about the supernatural causes. We want to know what would the explanation of the data look like if there were no supernatural explanations. Okay, so it says, assume for the sake of argument the correct explanation will not involve any supernatural being. So it says we're going to maybe possibly artificially constrain our assumptions. We're going to assume that there's no God or gods or deities or supernatural entities of any kind, and we're going to see, given that constraint, what the best explanation would look like. Okay, so science does this in other ways, where you, I don't know if you, how much physics you took in high school or how much you've taken in college, but often in physics you'll say, let's assume, so let's put in some artificial constraints and see what we get explanation-wise. So some of the laws of motion say, assume a frictionless plane, and this is what would happen. Well, we have frictionless planes? No. So in one sense, we've gotten an explanation of things there, or the truth of a law that is really not mapping reality. On the other hand, we've gotten something useful by assuming this condition which doesn't actually exist. We still learn some really important things, right? We can talk about what happens in the actual world in ways that are better informed because we know what would happen in a world with friction planes in it. And similarly, even if God exists, you might think, well, we can still learn some important things about what the right explanation would be if there were no supernatural beings involved, right? Okay, but now let me actually jump forward and give you an analogy, just to help you make better sense of this if it's not clicking. This Plantinga's analogy. So suppose I call the barbershop and I know that I have an appointment on Friday. And the receptionist says, actually, your appointment's on Thursday. And I say, well, I'm pretty sure it's Friday. Of course, I'm a little too overly polite to actually say this, so I would probably say something else. But suppose I said this. I said, I think it's on Friday, actually. And the receptionist says, well, all I can say is that I've got this little computer program that does our schedules, and it says that it's Thursday. It's in there as Thursday. That doesn't mean your appointment is on Thursday. All I can tell you is that this program I'm looking at says that it's Thursday. Now, here's a question. Okay. Is the receptionist's testimony in conflict with my memory? Well, in a sense, yes, at least initially. When she says, hey, it's Thursday, and I say, well, it's Friday, we're in conflict. But she walks it back eventually and says, well, I can't say that your appointment is on Thursday. All I can say is that the evidence from this program suggests that it's on Thursday. If you only taking into consideration this computer program, you would conclude that it was on Thursday. No, that's artificial, right? I mean, we don't just take into consideration one source of evidence. It might be that she's implying, well, you have memory too, and maybe your memory is right. Maybe all things considered, we ought to conclude your appointment is on Friday. Okay, and in that sense, her testimony is actually not in conflict with my memory, right? She can say, well, if you just were to follow this computer program, you'd say it was on Thursday. And she can simultaneously admit, oh, well, but if you were to follow your memory, you'd conclude it was on Friday. So it's a similar case to the judge or the trial case, right? I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Because in the trial case, I said, look, you as the defendant can say, I admit if you were just taking into consideration the juror's perspective, you would conclude that I did this crime. But I have access to other evidence, which is my memory, that convinces me that I should conclude that I did not commit this crime. And you can even say, if I were in the juror's shoes, I would conclude that I did this crime. Right? It's a weird thing. But in one sense, the evidence that the jurors have is not in full conflict with my evidence from my memory, right? Because, well, in the case of the receptionist, you're artificially constraining your evidence base. You're saying don't take into consideration the memory, just look at the program, you conclude Thursday. But if you said, well, don't take into consideration the computer program, just look at my memory, you'd conclude Friday. Okay, so the point is, these two claims are not really ultimately in conflict or in a deep conflict, right? You could admit that the computer program supports the Thursday verdict and still claim, yeah, but that doesn't weaken my belief that it's on Friday. Okay. Point being, let me reshare here. Science, Plantinga says, is doing exactly what is happening in the barbershop case. Science is saying, I can't tell you whether there's a God. All I'm saying is, if you assume that there's not a God, here's the verdict that you get. That doesn't tell you whether God exists. Right? That just says, if you assume God doesn't exist, here's what you should conclude. Right? But now when science goes on to say, assume God doesn't exist for the sake of argument, and here's the results that we get, that's not going to be in conflict with faith or with your faith that says that God does exist, right? So if God doesn't exist, here's the results that you get. God does exist. Those two claims are not in conflict, right? Neither undermines the other. Similarly, if I said, I could tell you, I think that what caused my alarm to go, what caused my alarm to go off was raccoons. Right? They were screwing around, they tripped the sensor or something like that. But I could also say, if it wasn't raccoons, it was a robber. Assuming that the explanation is not raccoon based, it's a robber. I'm not contradicting myself when I say I think it was raccoons, and when I say at the same time, in the same breath, if it wasn't raccoons, it was a robber. Right? So I think it was raccoons, but assuming that it's not raccoons, my next best explanation is that it was a robber. Similarly, when you say, well, assume for the sake of argument that let's just not take supernatural causes into effect or into consideration. Let's assume naturalism for the sake of, just for the sake of argument. Well, any result you get is not going to be in conflict with the claim that God exists or whatever, any other supernatural claim, right? Because you've kind of just artificially constrained those explanations out. Okay, so this is Plantinga's argument that, whenever you get whatever science saying we evolved to have the religious beliefs we have and therefore they're not truth-oriented, or that God has not intervened in nature, that's what science saying that, or possibly even other reason-based but non-science-based sort of conflicts with faith. At least in the scientific case, he's saying, we don't have a true conflict. We have merely a weak conflict. We have evidence that points to a conclusion opposite of faith, but that shouldn't, rationally speaking, weaken our faith-based belief, right? Yeah, so to try to think up a non-science-based example here, you might, and just to make it totally simple, you might say, well, just look at your perception. Say that your faculty of perception, I'm going to stop sharing here, your faculty of perception does not include the perception of God. Right. Well, let's just dumb it down to like your visual perception or your five senses. Right? You do not directly perceive God. Now, that may not be true for everybody, right? Maybe some people do. Let's just say in your particular case, you have not directly perceived God. Is this in anything more than weak conflict with your faith? No, this is a really simple case in which we've got merely weak conflict, right? If you were just taking into consideration your perception, you would conclude that God doesn't exist. But that's not in conflict with your belief that God exists, right? Because it shouldn't necessarily weaken your belief because you're artificially constraining your evidence base, right? evidence base includes so much more than just perception. So you can say in the same breath and have no inconsistency in your belief. If I were just taking into consideration my perception, I would conclude that God doesn't exist. And yet I still believe that God exists, and rationally so. Okay, so summing up real quick. Plantinga is a Christian, in case you hadn't realized that. And he thinks, even though he does argue that faith is a distinct faculty from reason, he does not think that faith and reason are in conflict, or in anything more than weak conflict. In the same sense that your perception and your memory can be in conflict. So he thinks that we're roughly in the case, in the situation of the court case. I mean, and at worst case scenario, we're in the situation of the court case. There may be some science-based evidence points against the existence of God. It doesn't actually count against it. It shouldn't weaken your belief in God. If you were really following the evidence, you wouldn't weaken your belief in God based on the science, right? Because the science artificially constrains your evidence base in term the evidence base on which it's based. Right, so it says, oh, if you only took into consideration certain kinds of explanations, then you would conclude God doesn't exist. That's the worst you get out of science. And I think there's an argument to be made that good science doesn't even get you there. Right? Good science will not get you to the claim that God doesn't exist. That's not what they're concerned with. But even if it did, it would be only by artificially constraining the evidence base by saying, well, we're not going to take into account we're not even going to countenance, we're not even the explanation, any explanation that assumes that God exists. So Plantinga says, and for that reason, if science contradicts your faith, it really doesn't count against your faith. Right? So that's Plantinga's argument, and we will stop there.